Chapter 1. The Boy. The year was 1276. In a quiet, sunny Scottish valley, a group of Scottish nobles rode towards a farm. The nobles rode handsome horses and wore rich clothes. Each noble had a boy with him, but they carried no weapons because this was a meeting of truce. Scotland had no king. The old king died without a son or daughter. The English king, Edward I, wanted to choose a new king for Scotland. The Scottish nobles wanted to choose their ruler, so there was war. The fighting went on, and things were difficult. There was no food because the farmers were fighting for the nobles. Edward I, Longshanks they called him because he had long legs, called a truce. The bravest nobles came, leaving their weapons behind. They came to the meeting place, a large farm building that belonged to a farmer called MacAndrews. They tied their horses outside and went in. One of the neighbouring farmers was a man called Malcolm Wallace. He was a strong, brave man who wanted Scots to rule Scotland. He had two sons, John, who was 18, and William, then only 7. William had his father's blue eyes. Malcolm's wife died when William was born. Later that same day, Malcolm and John rode off to the MacAndrews farm, carrying farm tools with them as weapons. William watched them. He loved his father and wanted to be like him. He ran to his horse and rode after them. They stopped on the hill above the farm. "Stay here," Malcolm said to William. When Malcolm and John arrived at the farm building, everything was quiet. No people, no horses. They held their weapons ready and pushed open the door. They looked up, and their hearts stopped. 30 nobles and 30 boys, and 1 farmer, all dead, tied by the neck. They heard a sound behind them and quickly turned. William stood there, looking up at the bodies.
"William,
At first,
get out of
William
here!"
did not think
shouted John.
the bodies were real. Then he touched one and realized. He shut his eyes to the terrible picture and ran this way and that, knocking into bodies. Malcolm caught William and held him. "English murderers," he said. That night, a group of local men met at the Wallace farm. William listened from the door. "The nobles who wanted to fight are dead," said Malcolm. "So we have to show the English that we won't lie down and serve them. We're not dogs, but men." They rode off the next day to attack the English. William stayed at home and fought the English in a game with his friend, Hamish. Night came. William watched through a window. His father and brother did not return. But they returned the next morning. Old Campbell, Hamish's father, brought their bodies. "William, come here, my boy," said old Campbell kindly. William looked away and shut his eyes. He looked back, but the bodies of his father and brother were still there. William stood at the graves, and the neighbours looked at the boy. What would happen to him now? A little girl of 5, with long red hair, came towards him. She handed William a flower, the purple flower of Scotland. Their eyes met, and then the girl walked back to her mother. A tall, dark man rode towards the crowd who stood near the graves. William looked at him. "Uncle Argyle?" William said. That night, the boy and his uncle sat together at the table. Argyle had no wife or children, but he would take the boy home with him. Malcolm's sword lay on the table. William tried to lift it. "First learn to use this," Argyle said, pointing to William's head, "and then I will teach you to use that." William did not take much with him to Argyle's house, only his mother's wedding dress and his father's sword. When they left the empty farm, he looked back only once. The Rebel. Years later, a beautiful young French princess walked through the great rooms of a London castle. She came into a large room. Longshanks, tall and handsome, stood in front of his nobles. He saw Isabella. "Where is my son?" he shouted. "I send for him, and he sends you, his new wife. How can the son of the King of England be so weak?" His eyes shone angrily. He turned back to his nobles. "I want to rule France, but first I must rule Scotland. Nobles are the key to the Scottish door. We must give land here in England to Scottish nobles. We must give land in the Highlands and Lowlands of Scotland to our own nobles." "But our people do not want to live among the Scottish rebels," said one old noble. "Then we shall make a better offer. We shall bring back the old rule of first night. A girl who lives on a noble's land must spend her wedding night with the noble of the land, not with her husband." Isabella's blood went cold. She thought of her own wedding night just past. Her new husband did not come to her bedroom. He preferred to be with his friend, Peter. Longshanks looked at her, smiling. Soon after, many miles north of London, a group of horsemen rode up the hill to Edinburgh Castle. In the centre of the group was a handsome young man on a fine horse. His shoulders were strong, and he carried a heavy sword at his side. Robert, 17th Earl of Bruce, was a fighting man. 24 Scottish nobles, all friends of Robert, the Bruce, sat round a large table in the central room of the castle. When Robert came in, they were silent. Robert the Bruce wanted to be king of Scotland, and these Scottish men were on his side. The Baliol's also wanted to rule. They had many friends too, and there was war between the two families. The Baliol's and the Bruces were all brave men, but people could not trust them. They looked after themselves first, and Scotland second. Sometimes they fought with the English, and sometimes against them. Lord Mornay, a young noble and friend of Robert, spoke.
"The people want us to fight now. They're very angry about this new English rule of first night."
"We must wait," said Robert, "until we are ready." A day's journey from Edinburgh, there was a different world. Lanark was a village of rough streets and stone houses, a market for local farmers, a place for people to meet. Today was market day. There was music and dancing. There was good food to eat and beer to drink. English soldiers watched. Market days were good for the English rulers. When the people were enjoying themselves, they were not fighting. They watched a young man ride into the village. His eyes were blue, and his hair was light brown, shining yellow in the sun. He wore a farmer's clothes, but he did not look like a farmer. With his straight back, strong body, and intelligent face, he looked dangerous. Everyone noticed the new arrival. Old Campbell, his bright red hair now going grey, watched with his old rebel friend, MacLanach. The young man got off his horse and walked through the crowd.
"MacLanach,"
old Campbell said quietly.
"Could that be
Murren MacLanach
William
was also
Wallace?"
watching. She was now the most beautiful girl in the village, maybe in all of Scotland, with her long red hair. She was standing in a group of girls. William saw her. Did he remember her? William started to speak to Murren, but just then his old friend Hamish walked up to him. The two men smiled. "Have you come back to your father's farm?" Hamish asked. "Yes." "Good to see you again," William said. He shook hands with his father's old friends. It began to rain. Everyone ran inside, but not William. He stood and watched the rain. That night, William stood at the door of the farmhouse and remembered his years there with his father and brother. He looked across the valley at the MacLanach house, friendly through the storm. Smoke from the kitchen fire climbing into the sky. The MacLanachs were surprised to hear a knock at the door so late. When MacLanach opened the door, there, outside, in the rain, was William Wallace on his horse. "Good evening. Can I speak with your daughter?" he asked. "Murren, would you like to go for a ride on this fine evening?" Before her parents could say no, Murren jumped up behind William, and they disappeared through the trees. They rode up high into the hills. They came to a group of trees. On the other side of the trees, the ground fell away below them. They were looking down on a beautiful lake. They stood together and said nothing. William took Murren home. Before he went, he put something in her hand. Then he jumped on his horse and rode away. Murren and her mother looked at the present. A dried flower. The same flower that 5-year-old Murren gave to William at his father's grave. The next day, William started work on the farmhouse. He climbed up on the roof to mend some holes where the rain came in. MacLanach rode up and asked William to come to a meeting. They rode together deep into the hills. There they met with 20 men, all farmers.
"We put ourselves in danger to bring you here, because you are the son of Malcolm Wallace. Do you understand?"
"I do," William answered. He knew rebels when he saw them.
"Every day the English send in more soldiers. When Malcolm Wallace was alive, we met here for every attack,"
Old Campbell explained.
"You have come back, and we ask ourselves, are we still men? Will you be one of us?"
"I came home to be a farmer and to have a family," said William. He looked at Old Campbell and Hamish, and walked away to the horses. On the way home, he stopped and looked at the graves of his father and brother for a long time. William did not see Murren for 2 weeks. Then there was a wedding in the village. Helen MacLanach, a cousin of Murren, was marrying a local boy, Robbie. Everyone came. There was plenty of food, beautiful wild flowers, and happy music. The new husband and wife, and their families and friends, came out of the church. The wedding party began. Suddenly, there was the noise of horses. An English noble rode towards them at the head of a group of English soldiers. The villagers went quiet. The nobleman, Lord Bottoms, was about 50, grey-haired and fat, with a red face. "These lands belong to me," he said, "and by the rule of First Knight, I am here to take this young woman to my bed on the night of her wedding." No one moved. "No, by God!" shouted Helen's father. The soldiers were ready for this. In a second, their swords were pointing down at Helen's father and Robbie. The men wanted to fight, but Helen held onto them tightly. "I prefer to spend one night with this man than lose both of you forever," she said. Then one of the soldiers pulled her up onto his horse behind him. William and Murren went again to the group of trees in the hills that night. They sat together above the lake and thought of Helen on her wedding night. They talked about their love and their hopes. They kissed, long and hard. "I want to marry you," said William, "but no Englishman will take you on our wedding night." They married, secretly, in an old, empty church. Murren gave William a white handkerchief with the flower of Scotland on it. They spent their wedding night under the stars. For the next 6 weeks they met when they could, at night, and sometimes in the day. But they did not show that they were husband and wife. When Murren was having a baby, they would be safe from Lord Bottoms. Then they would explain to their friends about the secret wedding. They were both in Lanark one market day. Their eyes met, but they did not speak. William walked on. Some English soldiers were sitting at a table and drinking quite near. They watched Murren, who was now more beautiful than ever, buying some bread. She was walking past when one of them suddenly caught her wrist and threw her to the ground. "Where are you going, my lovely?" he asked. The other soldiers laughed. He fell on top of her and pulled at her clothes. Murren bit him hard and tried to get away. Suddenly, William was there, and he caught the soldier's arm from behind. He threw him into his friends and turned the table over on top of them. One of the soldiers began to shout, "Rebels! Rebels!" Other soldiers came running. The villagers tried to stop them. "Run, William, run!" they shouted. "Are you all right, Murren?" William asked. "Take the horse and go. I'll meet you at our group of trees." William fought off 2 more soldiers. He watched Murren escape. Then he ran off through the crowd, in and out of the narrow streets. Soldiers were everywhere. Heselrig, head of the English soldiers, arrived, too late. William escaped into the trees and disappeared. He thought Murren was free, but Murren did not escape. She fell from her horse, arrived at the group of trees in the hills. "Murren," he called softly, and then again, more loudly. "Murren!" He shouted, but there was no answer. Murren was in prison. Heselrig looked at her proud eyes. "Why isn't she afraid of me? She's just a girl," he thought to himself. "And who is this man who can fight 6 of my soldiers at the same time and beat them?" he asked. "His name is William Wallace," one of the soldiers answered. "He has a farm along the valley. Let's burn it. I want him, not his farm. And he wants you, my beautiful girl, and you will bring him to us." Heselrig took Murren into the village square and tied her to a tree. The villagers came to watch. "An attack on the king's soldiers is an attack on the king, and this is what happens," he shouted. He calmly walked up to Murren, took out his knife, and cut her throat. Blood ran from the cut, and she was dead. William found his friends at old Campbell's farm. "Have you seen Murren?" he asked them. "She got away. I saw her. I saw her." William searched their faces. Old Campbell told William that Murren was dead. William could see that he was not lying. He went outside. The moon shone on the purple flowers among the grass. William's wild screams, angry and sad, cut through the black night. William Wallace jumped on the nearest horse and rode to his farm. He took his father's great sword from its hiding place. The rebels followed. All through the valley, people took up their weapons and ran behind him towards Lanark, where Heselrig and his men were waiting. Wallace rode on. He stopped in front of the line of soldiers just outside the village. He was not afraid. The battle was ready to kill. No one could stop Wallace and his angry followers. English soldiers lay dead everywhere. Wallace found Heselrig and pulled him out by his hair to the square. His wild eyes looked at the face of Murren's murderer. He took his sword and cut Heselrig's throat in one movement. The people were shouting, "Wallace! Wallace!" But he did not hear them. He looked at Murren's blood on the ground. He looked at the blood of the Englishman on his sword. He knew he would fight as a rebel from this day until he died. Lord Bottoms sat on his horse outside his castle. He was getting his men ready to find the rebels and to kill William Wallace, as an example to the people of Scotland. He gave a soldier a letter to take to the Lord Governor at Stirling Castle. But the soldier did not get past the castle walls. Wallace and his men were waiting outside. Suddenly, there were Scots everywhere. Bottoms tried to shout orders. The rebels pulled him from his fine horse. Wallace tied his hands and threw him onto an old and tired horse. "Go back to England. Tell them that Wallace is a free man of Scotland. Our sons and daughters belong to us, not to the King of England. Tell them, Scotland is free." They put Murren in the ground the next day. They cut a flower of Scotland into the stone by her grave. William put the white handkerchief next to his broken heart. Far off in London, Princess Isabella sat in the castle with her friend, Nicolette. She watched Prince Edward playing ball games with his friends in the garden. Nicolette told her news of Scotland and the story of William and Murren. This was the kind of man that moment Isabella would like. Longshanks arrived. "You play games here, boy?" he shouted at his son. "The rebels are attacking our soldiers in Scotland. They have sent Lord Bottoms back to England." He knocked Edward to the ground. "I'm going to France now. I'm leaving Scotland to you. Do you understand?" He pulled Edward up by the throat. "And turn yourself into a man." The king left. Back in Scotland, Robert the Bruce sat with his father. "It's time to fight like William Wallace. All Scotland is with him. This is no time to talk with the English," said the young Robert. "Fighting is not enough. Yes, Wallace is brave, but a dog is brave. You're noble. You are clever and brave. We'll go with these rebels on our lands in Scotland, but we'll stand against them on our lands in the south. Longshanks will do anything to rule Scotland. We will too." William sat near a small fire, thinking. The ground was wet from days of rain, but with the trees above their heads, they were dry enough. Hamish looked into the dark forest round them, his eyes searching for movement. Old Campbell was mending weapons. Guards were standing further away. "What do we do when Longshanks sends all of his northern army against us?" William asked. "That's a good question," answered old Campbell. "They have many horses and new weapons. We have only swords and weapons that we make on our farms." They'll ride right over us, said Hamish.
So, we fight the Highland way, said old Campbell. Attack and run into the hills. Burn everything on the way.
Then it is our own land and villages that we burn. But could we beat? Looked up at the trees and thought, I want the men to make 100 spears. Each spear will be twice as tall as a man. Before Hamish could ask William any more questions, the guards brought in some new rebels. Men came from all over Scotland every day to fight with William Wallace. But any one of them could be a spy for Longshanks. The new men looked at William Wallace, and their faces shone. William was dirty like the others, and his hair was wet and full of leaves. But they saw the fire inside him. It was that fire that they wanted to follow. Among the new rebels was a handsome young man from Ireland called Stephen. William spoke to them all. Show us that you can live without food and sleep, and then you can fight for us. 100 English horsemen rode in straight lines across open country. Lord Dolecroft rode in front. They were looking for William Wallace and his rebels. Sometimes they came very close. They found fires still smoking, but they never saw them. Until one day, when they saw Hamish and a group of rebels near some trees. The Scots saw the horsemen and ran like frightened animals. "After them!" Dolecroft shouted, and kicked his horse. They followed Hamish and his hungry and tired men across an open field with low hills all round. "Now we have them!" shouted Dolecroft. He rode into the field, but the ground was very wet and the horses' legs disappeared up to their knees. Suddenly, there were Scots everywhere, waving swords above their heads. William Wallace gave the order to attack. Every Englishman died. The news of Wallace's win over the English travelled quickly. The rebels hid in an empty farm building. The farmer was friendly and gave them food and clothes. William slept, while old Campbell and Stephen talked about battles and how to win them. Hamish came in. "News has arrived," he called softly. William woke up. "The English are sending a great army to Stirling Castle. Some say there are 10,000, some say 20, and the Scots are coming down from the Highlands." Stood high on a hill above open country. A river cut through the field in front of it. A wooden bridge crossed the river in front of the castle. On the 17th of June, 1297, a group of Scottish nobles stood on a smaller hill looking down onto the field, ready for battle. Robert the Bruce was in prison, so Lord Mornay took his place at the head of the Scottish army. From the other side of the bridge, they watched the great English army moving. "It looks like 20,000, shouted Lachlan, another noble. "But our spies say it is 10,000. "And we have only 2,000, said Mornay. The nobles did not think there would be a battle. They were ready to make a truce with the English. The English army stood in front of the castle walls and along the river. They were in straight lines, foot soldiers with swords at the front, horsemen with spears at the back. Their weapons were new and shining. The Scots had leather shirts and farm tools.
"So many,"
said one young soldier, looking over the river. "If the nobles make a truce, they'll send us home," replied an old soldier standing next to him. "If not, we'll attack. They'll stay on their hill, and we'll die. They'll ride home and call themselves brave."
"I don't want to fight so that they can have more land."
"Neither do I," said the old one, and he turned and walked away from the battle towards home. Others followed, first one by one, and then in groups. Lachlan shouted at them to stop, but they did not listen. "Why do they have to die for us?" said Mornay. But suddenly they did stop. William Wallace rode into the middle of the Scots army with his rebels, his fair hair flying in the wind, his strong arms showing under his ordinary leather shirt. He rode up to the nobles. "This is our army," said Lachlan. "Do you want to serve?" "If this is your army, why are the men leaving? I served Scotland," to look at the men. "We didn't come to fight for them," shouted the old soldier. And another man called, "Home! The English are too many! We'll all die!" Wallace held up his hand to speak, and the army was silent. "Sons of Scotland," he shouted, "I am William Wallace. You have come here to fight as free men. Yes, if you fight, perhaps you'll die. If you run, you may live for a time. But at what cost? Perhaps they'll kill us. But I say, we'll always be free." The army of Scotsmen answered with one voice. A great shout went up. "We will be free!" "Fine words," said Stephen, coming up behind Wallace. "Now what do we do?" "Follow our plan. Bring out the spears. Put them in the front line," ordered Wallace. Then he rode with Lachlan and Mornay to talk to the English. They met on the bridge. Lord Talmadge, head of the English army, made an offer. "The king will give you lands in York," he began. Wallace stopped him. "I have an offer for you," he said. "Take your army straight back to England. Ask every Scots man, woman, and child on the way to forgive you for 100 years of murder and stealing. Then, perhaps, you and your men will live. If not, every one of you will die today." Wallace turned to Lachlan and Mornay. "Be ready. Follow my orders," he told them. He rode back to the army, and they followed. The English quickly moved their horses across the bridge. They lined up opposite the Scots. Then the English foot soldiers began to cross behind them. The English horsemen stood tall and proud. Their horses were in purple and red. No one could beat them. Talmadge ordered them to attack. The Scots stood and waited. The English horses came at them, nearer and nearer. "Wait!" shouted Wallace. "Wait!" Wallace's men brought out their secret weapons, long spears, each one twice as tall as a man. They pointed them at the horses. The English could not stop their horses, and their swords were too short. The long spears cut the men and horses to pieces. Everyone on the battlefield listened to the screams of the dying English. The English pushed their foot soldiers across the bridge. Following Wallace's orders, Lord Mornay rode with his horsemen away from the battle. The English saw Mornay leave and thought now they would win. Wallace lifted his sword. "For Scotland!" he screamed. He ran towards the English, his brave rebels behind him. They attacked and killed all the soldiers in the field, and then pushed onto the bridge. More English soldiers were still trying to get onto the bridge from the other side. The Scots caught the men in the middle and cut them down. The water below the bridge was red with blood. The English began to realize that they could not win. Some stayed and fought bravely, but others turned and ran. Among them, Lord Talmadge. Just at that moment, Mornay and his men attacked the English from the side. The river was easy to cross on horseback behind the trees to the east. The English ran, trying to escape the Scottish swords. The terrible Battle of Stirling was finished. The Scots lifted Wallace up onto their shoulders. The nobles and ordinary Scotsmen shouted with one voice, "Wallace! Wallace! Wallace!" On a field in northern France, the English king was angry. His army was fighting a long, slow war against the French. "Why aren't we already in Paris? We'll have to spend the winter here now." "We cannot," answered General Peters bravely. "Half the men will die of cold and hunger." "We'll bring our army from Scotland here in the spring," said Longshanks. But just then a rider arrived. He was tired and dirty. He handed the king a letter. Longshanks read the letter. Suddenly, his face looked old and grey. "We have no army in Scotland." Chapter 3, he said, First Lord of Scotland. After the Battle of Stirling, William Wallace was famous all over Scotland. He rode into Edinburgh and up to the castle, his friends at his side. The people looked at him with wide eyes like children. The nobles, in their fine clothes, did not understand how an ordinary man could win a great battle like that, when the Bruces and Balliols could not. Robert the Bruce was now out of prison, and he stood among the other nobles as William walked into the castle. He could see at once that this Wallace would never serve any other man. A man began to read. "In the name of God, Sir William Wallace, we make you First Lord of Scotland." They gave him a gold ring of office, and the nobles went down on their knees. Maybe William could be First Lord, but he could not be king because he was not a nobleman. William watched as the nobles immediately began to fight among themselves. They wanted to find a king, but still they could not agree. William turned and walked away. "Sir William," one noble cried, "where are you going?" He turned back, his eyes burning with anger. "We have beaten the English.
But they'll come back, because you won't stand together.
William looked at Robert the Bruce as he spoke.
There's only one side to be on, not the Bruces, not the Balliols, but the side of the Scottish people. We must fight so that the people can be free. What will you do?
Another noble asked.
I'll take the fighting into England and beat the English on their own land, said William.
He looked round at the open mouths of the nobles and left the castle. A few weeks later, far away in London, Prince Edward and his friend, Peter, listened, afraid. Doors crashed open and walls shook. Longshanks was back from France. He arrived in Edward's rooms, high up in the castle, and looked at the two young men with cold, black eyes.
"What is the news from the north?"
"Nothing to report,
he asked,
Father,"
said Edward.
"What? A bunch of rebels beats our army at Stirling, and you say nothing to report?"
The king's face burned angrily.
"I have ordered more men to serve as soldiers," said Edward. "We'll have a large army by the spring. We know from my cousin, the governor of York, that Wallace is near York now. But the winter is coming. The Scots will have empty stomachs, and they'll be weak. We'll catch this Wallace and tie him up by his neck in front of his rebels."
A man came in with a letter.
"Give it to me,"
the prince ordered proudly. He was beginning to feel strong. The feeling did not last. He read the letter, and his face went white.
"Wallace has taken York,"
he said slowly.
"Impossible!"
shouted Longshanks. The man also carried a bag, which he placed on a table. Edward looked in it and jumped back, shaking. Longshanks opened the bag and took out the bloody head of the governor of York, his own brother's son. He dropped the head back into the bag.
"What animal would do this?" said Peter quickly. "We shall stop him if he comes south of York."
Longshanks did not answer. He looked at Edward.
"Who is this who speaks before I ask him to?"
Before Edward could answer, Longshanks took Peter by the throat and threw him out of the window. Peter screamed just before he hit the ground. Edward ran to the window and looked down at Peter's body. Peter was the only person that he loved and trusted, and now his body was broken and bloody on the stones far below. He took a knife from his jacket and ran at his father. Longshanks smiled. At last his son was fighting for himself. His smile disappeared, and he took hold of his son and kicked him until he was almost dead.
"We must make a truce with the Scots,"
said Longshanks, feeling nothing for his son lying on the ground.
"But who should go? Not this weak son of mine. Not me. I do not want my head brought to London in a bag."
The Scots' army
Who
were
can
resting
I say?
outside York. They mended their clothes and weapons. William, Hamish, and Stephen were in the governor's rooms in the city, studying his papers. Old Campbell hurried in, almost too excited to speak.
"A group of Longshanks's men are here. They want to make a truce. Be careful, William. Perhaps they want to kill you."
"I hope they do," said Stephen, putting on his leather jacket. "I haven't killed an Englishman for 5 days." When William
and his 6 riders arrived at the meeting place, they found French guards outside the English tent.
"Longshanks, I have come!"
William shouted at the entrance. The guards pulled back the sides of the tent door, and there, in the shadows, stood a tall woman in fine clothes. William began to shake. Hamish looked at old Campbell. She was just like Murren. And when she moved towards them and into the light, she was more like her.
"I am the Princess of Wales," she said, "wife of the king's son. I come from the king, and I speak for him."
William looked at her and thought of his lost love. Isabella saw in him everything she wanted in a man. He was tall and strong. His hair was wild, and his eyes were soft. Here was a man who could win battles, a man that armies would follow. And yet he could ride away from it all, and it would not matter to him. William got off his horse. In his eyes, Isabella saw something new in the face of a man, a deep sadness, and she knew that it was for Murren. "It's battle that I want, not talk," said William.
"But now that I am here, will you speak with the woman?"
She went into the tent, and he followed her. Inside were Nicolette and Lord Hamilton, one of Longshanks's men.
"I understand that you are now First Lord of Scotland," the princess began. "Did God tell you to kill the good people of York?"
"We attacked York because every English attack on Scotland starts from there," said William.
"And to cut off the head of my husband's cousin?"
"Your husband's cousin found and murdered all the Scottish women and children in York before we attacked. They threw more than 100 dead people over the city walls." Isabella went white and looked at Hamilton. She saw that it was true. "He's lying," said Hamilton, speaking to her in Latin. When William answered them in Latin, they both jumped in surprise. And then he spoke in French. "Ask your king who is lying." The princess asked Nicolette and Hamilton to wait outside. She made the king's offer of land and money. Wallace turned to leave. Isabella spoke quietly so that no one could hear.
"I know your story. I know of Murren."
"She was my wife," William said, just as softly. Suddenly, he wanted to talk, and he told her of Murren, of everything that happened many years before in the MacAndrews farm building, when he and his father found 30 murdered Scottish nobles. "You are strong inside like Murren. You will be a good queen. Tell your king that he will never rule William Wallace. He will not rule any Scot while I live." William walked through the empty streets of York that night. When the sun started to come up, he returned to Hamish and the others. Their fire was still burning. "Want some food?" Hamish asked. William shook his head. "No word from Edinburgh?" "Yes." Hamish waited for a few seconds and then went on. "They're not sending any more men, William." "They know about York, and they won't send more soldiers." William looked at the fire. "If I take this army to London, half the men will die of illness or hunger on the way. We must go back to Scotland. But we have not finished yet." In London, Isabella reported on her meeting with Wallace. She listened to the king talking about his plans. Soldiers were already on their way from Wales and France, and with terrible new weapons that could cut through metal like a knife through butter. She realized that the king did not want a truce. Her words to William Wallace were lies. The king used her to win time. And now his soldiers were getting ready to attack the Scots army from the sides and from behind. She returned to her rooms, shaking angrily and thinking of a plan.
"I will send Nicolette to my castle in the north," she thought. "On the way she can find Wallace and his men.
The Battle of
She can tell
Falkirk
them
was
to
more
keep-
terrible than Stirling. Of all the Scottish nobles, only Mornay was there with 100 riders. Robert the Bruce did not come. The famous Scottish spears lined up. The English horses began the attack from the right. The English foot soldiers shot their terrible new weapons at the spearmen from the left. Wallace ordered Mornay to attack the foot soldiers before they could shoot again. Mornay did not attack. From the English side, Longshanks watched Mornay riding away from the battle with his men. The English nobles turned to their king in surprise. Longshanks explained.
"His payment is new land in England and Scotland."
William felt helpless. With Mornay gone, no one was guarding the spearmen. The English foot soldiers shot again, their terrible weapons cutting the Scottish spearmen to pieces. The rest of the Scottish army did not wait for orders. They ran, screaming, towards the English. The battle was long and hard. Soldiers on both sides fought bravely, but there were too many English. Towards the end of the battle, the English horsemen attacked again. Wallace saw them coming. He pulled the first rider to the ground. It was Robert the Bruce, fighting for the English. Wallace looked at his face. In that second, he realized that there was no hope for Scotland. He felt weak. The Bruce waved his sword at Wallace.
Fight me! Fight me!
He shouted. But Wallace could not fight now. He took the gold ring of office off his finger and threw it at Robert the Bruce's feet. Stephen rode up quickly. He pulled William up behind him onto his horse, and the two rode away from the battle. Robert the Bruce watched Wallace escape. He looked at the ground and saw the blood of his countrymen. "I will never fight on the wrong side again," he said. A few days later, William was at Murren's grave. Rain fell hard on his face. He held in his shaking hand the white handkerchief, something from a better world. Rain was falling in London, too. Longshanks was smiling.
"All the Scottish nobles have agreed to serve me as their king. Now we can send soldiers from Scotland to fight in our armies in France." "Well, my flower," he said, turning to Isabella, "we have seen the last of your Wallace, I think."
She looked out of the window. Chapter 4. Her eyes as wet. Brave heart. William spent some months in France and Italy, asking for help for Scotland from the King of France and the Pope. He returned to Scotland with empty hands. They would not help. Lord Mornay lay in bed, looking out from the window of his high room at his rich land. When he slept, his head was full of pictures of William Wallace, running towards him at Falkirk, with his sword held high and murder in his eyes. Suddenly, Mornay heard the sound of a horse, Not outside the castle, but inside. Impossible. Surely he was asleep. Then he heard shouts too, and screams from below. Then silence, and then a sudden great crash. William Wallace rode into his bedroom. Mornay never spoke again. Wallace cut through his neck with one quick movement. The guards at the door stood with their mouths open. Wallace threw a jacket over his horse's head. He kicked the animal hard. The horse jumped, crashed through the window, and horse and rider sailed through the air, down, down, past the castle walls and into the lake below. They swam to land. Wallace got on his horse and rode away. From behind him came the shouts, "Wallace! Wallace!" Isabella found Longshanks and Edward in the castle garden. "You smile? You have heard the news? The rebels are starting to fight again in Scotland," said Edward. "I smile because I have a plan to catch your Wallace," she spoke to the king. "Send me to my castle in the north to speak for you. Wallace trusts me. Find 30 of your best killers. I will find a place for a meeting. He will come to the meeting, and we will kill him. Easy." Longshanks, now old and weak, studied her strong face.
"You see, my stupid son, I have found
Hamish
you
and
a
Stephen
real
brought William the news. "Longshanks has sent the princess to make a truce." "And where does she want to meet?" asked William. "It's very strange. In the MacAndrews farm building." William and his friends arrived at the farm building. Wallace handed his sword to Hamish, so that everyone in the building could see. The killers waited inside, their knives ready. Wallace came up to the guards outside the door. Suddenly, he pushed them inside and shut the doors. Rebels ran out of the woods and put great pieces of wood against the building. Then they burned it to the ground. Isabella could see the fire from the walls of her castle. A single rider came up to the castle. She sat and waited. After a while, she heard a small noise outside the window. In one quick movement, William pulled himself through the narrow window and into the room. "I understood at once," he said. "The MacAndrews farm. You remembered the story I told you, of when I was a boy." "I am so pleased to see you," said Isabella, softly touching his face. "I know that when you looked at me, you saw her." He turned away. "You must forgive how I feel," she said. "No man has ever looked at me as you do. A queen must love her husband, but she must also give him a child. With my husband, I cannot do both. Just think," she went on, "maybe you'll never be King of Scotland, but perhaps one day your blood will run through the King of England." "I cannot love you because of Longshanks," he said. "No, but you can love me just because I love you." Early the next morning, Wallace quietly said goodbye to Isabella. He quickly found his rebel friends, Hamish and Stephen. They saw he was full of fire again. The three of them began attacking English soldiers where they could find them. The Scottish nobles now wanted a meeting with Wallace. They said that they wanted to serve him and not Longshanks. "Why do you trust them?" asked Hamish, shaking his head. "You know they will give you to Longshanks." "You're probably right, but we can't win without them, Hamish. Standing together is the only hope for our people." "I don't want to die! I want to live!" shouted Hamish. "So do I," I want a home and children. I've asked God for these things, but He has brought me this sword, and if He wants me to die for my country, then I will." The three rode to the meeting place. On the way, William gave his knife to Stephen and his sword to Hamish. He felt that he was seeing them for the last time.
"Here he is,"
said Robert the Bruce, looking through a window.
"and he has no sword. My God, he has a brave heart."
William came into the house. He looked into the eyes of Robert the Bruce. The two men now saw the same picture, a free Scotland. William held out his hand towards Robert the Bruce. In seconds, there were English soldiers everywhere.
"No!"
screamed Robert the Bruce, who knew nothing of this plan. They tied William up like an animal, took him to London over the back of a horse, and threw him in prison. Longshanks was very ill. He was dying. He could not speak with his voice, only with his eyes. Isabella went to see him. She pulled him close to her by his hair, and spoke so softly in his ear that Edward could not hear.
"You see, we all die. Wallace will die tomorrow. But before you die, listen to this. Your blood dies with you. A child who has the blood of William Wallace is growing inside me."
William Wallace died slowly in front of a great crowd on the 23rd of August, 1305. They did terrible things to his body so that he would ask for forgiveness, but he would not. In the last seconds of his life, he saw Hamish and Stephen in the crowd, and behind them, Murren. For a moment he felt strong, and he cried out,
"We will be free!"